The conference room on the 42nd floor of Harrington Tower looked exactly like power was supposed to look. All clean angles and cold glass. The kind of space designed to make you feel smaller the moment you walk through the door. Rhett Callister had walked through a lot of difficult doors in his 38 years. The social worker's office after his mother left. The hospital corridor the night his wife didn't make it. The bank where a loan officer looked at his business plan like it was written in crayon and told him to come back when he had something real. He had walked through all of those doors without flinching, so he told himself this one would be no different. He was wrong. Because those other rooms hadn't had 6 members of the Harrington family seated along one side of a table like a wall of tailored certainty, each one watching him the way scientists watch something interesting under glass. And they hadn't had Arthur Harrington at the center, 71 years old, silver-haired, the kind of man who had made so many decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars that the number itself no longer seemed to register on his face. The folder in front of Rhett was thick. A paralegal had slid it toward him without ceremony about 4 minutes ago, and he had been reading since, his expression carefully neutral, his jaw carefully still. $1.2 billion. The number sat at the top of page 3 in clean, unhurried type, as if it were simply the most reasonable thing in the world. And beneath it, in the language that contracts use when they want to disguise what they're actually saying, was the rest of it. The part that mattered, full operational transfer within 90 days. Founder retained in an advisory capacity. Strategic direction to be determined by an executive committee appointed by Harrington Pharmaceutical Holdings. Advisory capacity. That was the phrase. That was the whole truth of what they were offering, dressed up in $1.2 billion of very expensive clothing. They weren't buying his company. They weren't even buying his technology. They were buying the right to decide what happened to it, and more specifically, the right to decide that nothing happened to it at all. Because Rhett had done enough research on the Harrington family to understand that a diagnostic tool capable of identifying rare pediatric metabolic disorders in under 48 hours was not something they wanted to bring to market. Not when their existing drug protocols for managing those same disorders generated $300 million a year in recurring revenue. They didn't want to build anything. They wanted to bury it quietly, pay him enough that he couldn't afford to be angry, and move on. He turned the page and felt the room shift, though nothing in it had moved. And then Arthur Harrington spoke. His voice was the kind that came from decades of never having to raise it. Smooth, measured, carrying just enough warmth to disguise how precisely it was aimed. "Mr. Callister," he said, "you've done something genuinely impressive. A man with your background, building what you've built, that's not a small thing. I want you to know that's acknowledged here." Rhett looked up from the folder. "But let's be honest with each other," Arthur continued, settling back slightly in his chair. "You built a discovery that's different from building a company. Discovery requires genius. What comes after that? Distribution, regulation, scale, relationships that took this family 40 years to develop. That requires something else entirely, something you haven't had time to acquire." There were no chuckles this time. The Harringtons were too polished for that. Instead, the silence that followed made the point for them. The silence of people who had never once questioned whether they belonged in a room. To Rhett's left, a woman named Diana Harrington, Arthur's eldest daughter and chief strategy officer of the holdings group, was watching him with the still, measuring patience of someone who had already decided what was going to happen and was simply waiting for reality to catch up. "We're not dismissing what you've created," she said, her voice several degrees cooler than her father's. "We're offering you the opportunity to ensure it reaches the world responsibly, with the infrastructure that can actually carry it. Responsibly." Rhett had been awake since 4 that morning. He had reviewed the contract 3 times before stepping into this building. He had read every interview Arthur Harrington had given in the last decade, and he knew, not suspected, knew, that in Harrington Pharmaceutical's vocabulary, responsibly meant slowly, and slowly meant profitably, and profitably meant not at all if the math didn't work in their favor. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Diana shifted slightly in her seat. And in that quiet, his hand moved without thinking, reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket. Not for his phone. He didn't carry his phone into meetings like this. It was a discipline he had built years ago, back when he was a lab technician working nights and a father working mornings, and the only thing standing between his daughter and a future he was afraid to think about was his own refusal to stop. What he reached for was smaller than a phone A piece of paper folded into quarters, soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded too many times. He didn't take it out, he didn't need to see it, he just needed to feel it there. A drawing, blue crayon mostly, with some yellow. A stick figure in a white coat standing next to a much smaller stick figure with a triangle dress and what was supposed to be a ponytail, though it had ended up looking more like an antenna. Above them, in the careful block letters of an 8-year-old who had recently decided that capital letters were extremely important, the words, "Dad, fix what is broken." Lena had made it 3 weeks ago after he had explained, in the simplest terms he could manage for someone in 2nd grade, what his company actually did. He had told her they built something that helped doctors figure out what was wrong with sick kids much faster, so the doctors could help them sooner. She had listened with that intense focus she got sometimes, the kind that made her look 45 years old, and then she had nodded very seriously and gone to get her crayons. The next morning, the drawing had been taped to his coffee maker. He had never moved it from that spot. He had simply folded it carefully and put it in his pocket, and it had been there for 3 weeks, and he touched it now, just briefly, just enough. When he looked back up at Arthur Harrington, something in him had changed temperature. Not hotter, not louder, something quieter and much more permanent, like a door closing gently but completely on a conversation that had been heading somewhere he was no longer willing to go. He closed the folder. The sound was soft, but it was the only sound in the room, and every person at that table heard it. "I appreciate the clarity," Rhett said. His voice was even the way a level is even, not forced, just true, "and I want to give you the same in return." He slid the folder back across the table, unhurried, deliberate. "This is a generous number, and I understand everything it could mean, but what you're describing isn't an acquisition, it's a handover. And what I built wasn't built to be handed over and managed quietly until it becomes convenient." He paused once, let that land. "So I can't sign this." Arthur Harrington didn't react immediately. He was the kind of man who processed unexpected information internally and only showed you the result. What he showed Rhett was a slight compression of his expression. Not anger, not quite. Something closer to the recalibration of someone who had not included this particular variable in his calculations. Diana said nothing, she simply watched. Rhett stood, buttoned his jacket with 2 even motions, and walked toward the door. And behind him, the room was so quiet that his own footsteps sounded very clear against the marble floor. He didn't look back. The elevator down was slow. 42 floors, and he stood in the center of it, watching the numbers descend, feeling the full weight of what he had just done pressing against his sternum from the inside. Not like regret, but like the moment after you've jumped from somewhere high and you're still in the air and the ground hasn't arrived yet. $1.2 billion. He had turned down $1.2 billion. The doors opened. Chicago's late afternoon pushed through the lobby as he stepped outside. October cold, sharp, and immediate, the lake somewhere nearby making the air taste like iron and distance. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, people flowing around him, the city entirely uninterested in what had just happened on the 42nd floor. His phone lit up in his pocket with a calendar reminder. Lena's school, parent-teacher conference. 6 o'clock, he had promised her teacher he wouldn't miss this one. He hailed a cab. The apartment was on the north side, 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades, but had good bones and cheap rent when he'd first signed the lease. And he had never left because Lena loved the climbing tree in the courtyard, and because moving felt like an admission that things weren't working, and things were working. Slowly, on his terms. He pushed the door open at 5:47 and was met by the smell of something faintly burned in the kitchen and the sound of a cartoon he didn't recognize. Lena was at the kitchen table, homework spread in front of her, eating cereal directly from the box with an expression of complete philosophical satisfaction. "You're early," she said, not looking up from what appeared to be long division. "I'm exactly on time," Rhett said, setting his jacket over the back of a chair. "And something's burning." "That's from before, I fixed it." She erased something vigorously, the toast got ambitious. He found the small, charred remains of 2 slices of bread on the counter beside the toaster, arranged on a paper towel with a careful dignity, as though Lena had wanted them to feel respected despite their failure. He threw them away, turned off the element she'd left on, and came back to the table. "How was it?" she asked. She wasn't looking at him, still focused on the long division, but the question was deliberate. She always asked. It was one of the things about her that sometimes made him catch his breath. The consistency of her attention, the way she tracked his moods, the way you tracked weather when you lived somewhere that changed fast. Big day, he said, same as he always said. She looked up then, 8 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and his stubborn jaw, and a small band-aid on her chin from falling off her bike on Saturday that she had refused to let anyone make a fuss about. "You look like the big day one," she said. He laughed. He hadn't expected to, but he did. "I think it was a draw." She considered this seriously. Draws are okay. Draws mean nobody lost. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and didn't say anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying. She went back to her long division. He went to change out of his suit. It wasn't until later, after the conference, where Lena's teacher explained she was reading 2 grade levels ahead and had recently taken it upon herself to reorganize the classroom library by color, which was not the system they used but was surprisingly effective. After dinner, after Lena had fallen asleep mid-sentence on the couch while telling him about something that happened at recess, after he had carried her to her bed and sat for a moment in the dark listening to her breathe. It wasn't until then that his phone started filling up. Messages from his CFO, Gwen Torrance, short and increasingly urgent, a missed call from their lead investor, 2 partner emails flagged in red, and a text from a number he didn't have saved which read in its entirety, "You have no idea what you just started." He sat in the kitchen with the lights low and read through everything. The shape of it became clear quickly, the way the outline of a storm becomes clear before it fully arrives. 2 of their pending partnership agreements had been placed under sudden administrative review. Language so similar between the 2 notices that it couldn't be coincidence. A federal grant they had been shortlisted for had been quietly removed from the agency's active consideration list. A journalist working on a favorable profile had sent a cautious email saying her editor wanted to hold the piece pending additional context. The Harrington family did not throw tantrums. They applied pressure to the right places at the right time and waited for the system to do the work for them. Rhett sat there for a long time, not moving. Because this was the part he had known was coming and had told himself he was ready for, and sitting alone in the kitchen at 11:15 at night, he understood that knowing something is coming and being ready for it were entirely different things. The doubt arrived quietly, the way cold came into an old apartment through gaps you couldn't find. Not through one obvious breach, but through 100 small places you hadn't thought to seal. Had he been reckless? Not selfish. He didn't think it was selfish. But reckless in a way that affected Gwen and the 12 people on his team and the 14 families in their clinical trial who were waiting on the next phase of funding. He thought about what Lena had said. Draws are okay. Draws mean nobody lost. But this wasn't a draw. This was the Harrington family, making sure he understood what losing looked like from the inside. He opened his laptop. The next morning's team meeting was uncomfortable before anyone said a word. Rhett could read his team the way he could read data. Patterns, anomalies, the information that lived between what people said and what they meant. Gwen arrived first, which she always did, and she set her coffee down with a precision that told him she had been awake most of the night. The lead engineers, Dara Ostrowski and her brother Penn, who had worked with Rhett since year 1 and communicated in half-sentences that the rest of the team found disorienting, came in together and sat at the far end of the table without their usual banter, which was telling. When everyone was seated, Gwen looked at him directly. "Tell me there's a plan." "There's a plan," Rhett said. "Can you tell me what it is?" "I'm working on the specifics." She closed her eyes briefly. "Rhett, we have 31 days of operating capital at current burn. The grant suspension cuts that to 22 if we can't find a bridge. 2 partners are stalling. 1 has already indicated they're pausing all activity with us pending, and this is their word, resolution of concerns." She paused. "These are the Harringtons' concerns. We both know that." "I know," he said. "Do you understand that this isn't just about you? That these are people's jobs, people's families?" "I understand," he said, "and I need 48 hours." The silence stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. It was Dara who finally spoke from the far end of the table without looking up from her screen. "The validation data from the Phase 2 cohort," she said. "We've been sitting on the full analysis because you said we weren't ready to publish." "We're not," Rhett said, "not in the conventional sense." "Are we ready in an unconventional sense?" He looked at her. She was still looking at her screen, but there was something in the angle of her head that told him she had already done the math on this before walking into the room. "Give me 48 hours," he said again. And it was not a plan, not yet. It was a direction, which was sometimes all you had and sometimes all you needed. What followed was not cinematic. There was no single dramatic moment, no revelation that changed everything in one instant. There was, instead, 47 hours of work that looked, from the outside, like very little. A man in a quiet office making calls, sending emails, reviewing documents, occasionally stepping away to bring Lena dinner when she texted that she was hungry. 3 calls to researchers at institutions that had no relationship with Harrington Pharmaceutical and very much wanted to establish one. A conversation with a journal editor he had known since graduate school, who listened for 20 minutes and then said thoughtfully, "If the validation data is what you're saying it is, that's a different conversation altogether." A partnership discussion with a hospital network in the Midwest that had been trying to solve the exact problem his diagnostic tool addressed. A conversation that had been exploratory 6 months ago and was now suddenly something concrete. The Harrington strategy depended on a single assumption, that Rhett Callister had nothing to offer anyone that the Harrington name couldn't overshadow. They had not considered that what he had built was not, at its core, a business. It was a solution, and solutions, properly documented and properly distributed, had a way of becoming undeniable regardless of how much institutional pressure was applied around them. On the morning of the 48th hour, he published the Phase 2 data through an open-access journal that had agreed to expedited peer review. He sent the hospital network a signed letter of intent. He gave the journalist the interview she'd asked for, on the record, unguarded, with the full dataset attached. And then he accepted the meeting request that had arrived from Harrington Tower the previous evening, marked urgent, requesting his availability at the earliest convenience. He wore the same suit he had worn to the first meeting. Not as a statement, because it was a good suit and he only owned 2 of them, and the other had a coffee stain on the lapel that Lena had been meaning to help him address with a cleaning tutorial she'd found online. The conference room on the 42nd floor was the same room. Same view, same long table, same cold architecture of wealth and certainty. But when Rhett walked in this time, he walked to the center of the table and sat down in the chair directly across from Arthur Harrington, not the chair he had been directed to, which briefly created a small uncertainty in the room that no one quite knew how to address. He set his phone on the table in front of him, screen down, and waited. The Harrington family entered in the same configuration. But something about the configuration had changed, the way a painting changes when the light in the room shifts. Same image, different quality of attention. Diana Harrington sat without preamble. "You published," she said. "I did. The partnership with Lakeshore Health System is signed as of this morning." A pause. Rhett had come to understand someone who processed information the way he did, quickly, internally, without displaying the working. What she displayed instead was a recalibration, small but perceptible. Arthur Harrington was looking at the copy of the published study that someone had placed in front of him. He read for a moment, turned a page, read again. The silence was a different quality from the last time. Not the silence of dominance, but the silence of genuine attention. "This validation cohort," Arthur said without looking up, "the identification rate. 91% in under 36 hours, Rhett said, compared to an industry average of 4 to 7 months using current diagnostic pathways." Arthur set the paper down. For the first time since Rhett had walked into this building, Arthur Harrington looked at him not as a variable to be managed, but as a person he was genuinely uncertain about. "You understand that this changes the discussion," Arthur said. "I was hoping you'd see it that way." Diana leaned forward slightly. "What do you want, Mr. Callister, concretely?" Rhett had thought about this carefully, not in abstract, not in principles, but in specifics, the way he thought about everything that mattered. "Operational independence," he said. "I lead the company. Your capital accelerates our timeline. No veto on clinical decisions, no strategic override on publication or distribution partnerships. You get 1 seat on the board, a return tied to market performance, not to approval by committee." He paused. "And the diagnostic tool reaches market within 18 months. That part is not negotiable." The silence after that held information. Arthur looked at his daughter. Diana looked at her father. Something passed between them that was too compressed to read, too private to be performed. It was Arthur who spoke finally, and his voice was different from the first meeting, less warm but more honest, and somehow more respectful for it. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I know," Rhett replied. A pause. Then Arthur nodded, a single motion, barely perceptible but carrying enough weight to shift the air. "Have your attorney's contact hours," Arthur said. "We'll have a revised term sheet by end of week." Rhett stood. He picked up his phone and buttoned his jacket, same 2 motions, same order. And when he turned toward the door, Diana Harrington spoke quietly. "Mr. Callister." He turned back. Her expression was still composed, still measured, but something in it had changed, the way something changes when it has been accurately seen for the first time. "What made you come back?" she asked. "After publishing, you didn't need to come back here." He considered the question. It was a real question, and she deserved a real answer. "Because my goal was never to walk away," he said. "It was to be taken seriously." He left the room. The door closed behind him with a quiet finality, and this time no one called after him with anything other than the plain intention of following through. The cab home smelled like pine air freshener and old upholstery, and Rhett sat in the back with his head against the window and watched the city go by. And for a few minutes he didn't think about anything at all. Just the lights and the motion, and the fact that the air inside the cab was warm. Lena was at the kitchen table again when he pushed the door open. Homework, cereal, and that same expression of philosophical satisfaction she wore when she had decided the evening was going exactly as planned. She looked up and ran her private assessment, the rapid internal survey she always ran when he came home late. "It's different today," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Good different or just different?" "Good," he said, "I think." She nodded slowly, then patted the chair beside her with the quiet authority of someone offering space at their table. "Sit. I have 3 more fractions, and then I'm done, and we can watch something." He came and sat, and she slid her worksheet toward him, and he helped her with the fractions. And it was ordinary and specific and real in the way that none of the things in that conference room had ever quite been. Later, when she was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Rhett sat on the couch with the lamp on low and took the folded drawing out of his jacket pocket and held it for a while. The crayon had faded slightly from being folded and unfolded too many times. The block letters were still clear. "Dad, fix what is broken." He thought about all the things that had been broken over the years and all the ways he had tried to address them. Some couldn't be fixed. He had learned that slowly, the way you learned things that were genuinely hard. But some could. And the ones that could required exactly 2 things, always. Someone willing to do the work, and someone who understood what the work was actually for. He had understood it today in that room, in a way he hadn't been able to fully articulate before, because he carried a crayon drawing in his pocket, and because there was a girl asleep in the next room who had looked at everything he was trying to build and reduced it, the way children reduced everything, to the simplest and most precise version of the truth. He wasn't fighting a family. He wasn't proving something to Arthur Harrington or his daughter or the industry that had told him, in various ways and through various intermediaries, that men with his background didn't belong at tables like that one. He was fixing what was broken. That was all, and it turned out that was enough. Enough to walk into that room, and enough to walk back out of it on his own terms, and enough to sit here now in the quiet of his own apartment with the drawing in his hands and feel, for the first time in a very long time, that he had not been reckless. He had been exactly who his daughter believed he was. And whatever came next, the negotiations, the term sheet, the long and uncertain road of turning a discovery into something that actually reached the families who needed it, he would face it the same way he had faced the room on the 42nd floor. Not as a man seeking permission, but as a man who already knew the answer to the question that mattered most. He folded the drawing back along its worn creases, careful at the corners, and set it on the coffee table where he would see it in the morning.